Pilot publicly humiliates black woman moments later. She suspends his license as the head of aviation. Power can shift in the blink of an eye. In the heart of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, a smug pilot sneered at a woman who just wanted to make it home in time to read her child a bedtime story. Little did he know that the passenger he humiliated was more than she appeared, far more. With security officials and onlookers frozen in shock, the tense confrontation left everyone on edge. In a world where prejudice still rears its head without warning, fate has a way of dealing its own brand of justice. This is the unbelievable story of a pilot, a woman, and karma's ultimate twist. The crowd at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport bustled on a mid-spring morning. Travelers lugged rolling suitcases across the polished floor, while overhead announcements echoed through the terminal. Children pleaded for snacks, business people tapped out frantic emails, and exhausted families eyed the departure boards with hope of a much-needed getaway. Among this sea of humanity was a woman named Alicia Grant. Alicia's elegance shone effortlessly. She walked with a poise and confidence that came from years of navigating hectic airports around the globe. Though her attire was simple, a tailored navy blazer, cream blouse, and comfortable yet stylish flats, she exuded an unspoken authority that turned heads. On this particular day, Alicia was flying to Washington, D.C. on a Delta Airlines flight. She was keen to arrive early for an important series of meetings concerning aviation regulations. As the new Deputy Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, she had earned her seat at the table through an incredible combination of persistence, intelligence, and skill. Not many people knew her face, but her name had begun to circulate in aviation circles as one to watch. She arrived at the check-in counter with a calm demeanor. Usually she traveled under the radar, rarely announcing her position unless it was absolutely necessary. Respect came naturally to Alicia. She gave it freely and expected little in return. But over time, she had learned it was wise to keep her identity low-key until it mattered. This approach helped her observe how different airlines and airports actually treated their passengers. Through these silent glimpses, she could better understand what needed to be reformed or praised within the aviation system. Still, on that morning, there was a subtle tension humming in her chest. Alicia had been offered a direct flight on a private charter due to her status at the FAA. However, she had turned it down, opting to experience commercial travel. She wanted to remain connected to the real experiences of the public. She checked in smoothly, advanced through security, and found her gate in Concourse B. Her flight was scheduled to depart in just under an hour. The waiting area was crowded, so Alicia moved toward a row of seats near the large glass windows, offering a panoramic view of the runway. There, she stood, quietly surveying the planes coming and going, each aircraft a testament to modern engineering and human ingenuity. At that moment, Alicia didn't realize her life was about to converge dramatically with a man who would go down as a cautionary tale in her career, Captain Lawrence "Rick" Tyler. Captain Lawrence Tyler was a seasoned pilot with over 25 years of experience under his belt. Tall, silver-haired, and notoriously proud, he cultivated an image of a classic aviator, a sort of old-world hero who believed he deserved deference everywhere he went. He prided himself on having flown everything from small regional jets to the mighty Boeing 777. Over time, he developed a reputation among airline staff for being curt, especially toward those he deemed unworthy of his respect. Captain Tyler believed wholeheartedly in a strict, hierarchical approach to aviation. To him, the captain's word was law. If a passenger, especially one he deemed difficult or entitled, stepped out of line, he believed it was his duty to put them in their place. He often threw around phrases such as "know your station," which grated on the ears of many cabin crew members. Yet, his flight performance was impeccable. No one could fault his handling of the aircraft, his landing precision, or his knowledge of aviation. For all his personal shortcomings, his professional skill was legendary. That morning, Captain Tyler was assigned to pilot the same Delta flight Alicia would be on. He was in a relatively good mood, having had a short break after a transatlantic route. As he walked through the terminal in full uniform, heads turned. He smirked whenever he noticed strangers glance at the 4 stripes on his shoulders. "Morning, Captain," said a gate agent, nodding respectfully as he approached. Tyler simply acknowledged him with the barest tilt of his chin. His confidence showed in every movement. He liked it when people jumped to serve him or accommodate his whims. As far as he was concerned, he had earned this reverence through decades of hard work. Still, a small annoyance nagged at him. The airline had introduced new guidelines urging pilots to be more mindful of passengers' comfort and well-being. Customer service metrics were factoring more and more into performance reviews, including those of senior staff like Tyler. He resented the idea of coddling passengers. He believed they should be grateful to fly, period. Upon reaching the gate podium, he collected his flight documents and conferred with the co-pilot. Everything seemed routine. Boarding would begin in about 30 minutes. Tyler had no idea that one of the passengers, standing calmly near the windows and quietly observing the traffic on the runways, was about to turn his entire career upside down. Passengers began to line up once the initial boarding call was announced. Families with children, first-class passengers, and those needing additional assistance were called first. Alicia Grant patiently waited for her boarding group to be called, gently tapping her phone to check the time. A few people recognized her from the news. Her promotion within the FAA had made a splash, but they hesitated to approach her, sensing she might want her privacy. When Group 3 was announced, Alicia stepped forward, scanning her boarding pass. The gate agent smiled and wished her a pleasant flight. With the same modest grin, Alicia thanked her and made her way down the jet bridge. The air felt slightly warm and humid, typical for Atlanta's climate, but Alicia managed not to break a sweat. She was accustomed to the varying conditions of airports around the globe. The cabin smelled of fresh coffee and the faint tang of disinfectant. Flight attendants guided the passengers to their seats, while overhead bins snapped shut. Alicia found her seat in the main cabin, near the wing. She always preferred a seat close to the wing for the smoothest ride. She tucked her carry-on into the overhead compartment, took out a book about new trends in aviation tech, and settled into her seat. She nodded politely to the passenger next to her, a young law student who offered a friendly smile. Across the aisle, a tired mother tried to calm a crying toddler. Alicia offered a sympathetic expression, remembering the days when she traveled with her own son when he was younger. Even though the crying child was shrill, she didn't mind. Babies cried. It was part of life. She tried to focus on her book to pass the time, occasionally pausing to glance out the window as ground crew vehicles whirred by. The flight attendants went through their usual announcements, showing how to buckle seat belts and locate emergency exits. Everything felt routine until a small commotion near the cockpit door drew Alicia's attention. Voices were raised. She couldn't make out the words at first, but it was clear that a passenger in first class was upset. A middle-aged woman with a rolling carry-on clashed with a flight attendant over overhead bin space. But something else was going on too. Alicia distinctly heard the pilot's voice, loud, authoritative, and dripping with condescension. "Ma'am, if you can't follow my crew's instructions, you need to deplane," he barked. "We're not a personal storage unit. You can't just shove your things wherever you like." The woman stuttered an apology, explaining that she had been told there would be room for her bag. The flight attendant tried to calm Captain Tyler, who was growing more irate by the second, snapping about overhead space and how passengers should learn the rules. Alicia's brow furrowed. This might be none of her business, but the pilot's behavior was unsettling. She caught a glimpse of him, tall, silver-haired, reeking of arrogance. He strode down the aisle a couple of rows, scanning for something or someone. Unbeknownst to him, this would be the first of many ill-tempered moments aboard this flight that day. Moments later, the flight attendants closed the aircraft door, preparing for departure. Captain Tyler returned to the cockpit, though not without shooting one last glare at the woman who had caused the bin space inconvenience. Alicia exhaled, hoping the tension would settle. The plane taxied to the runway and soon lifted off into Atlanta's clear sky. Outside the window, the cityscape shrank swiftly. Alicia turned her attention back to her reading, determined to keep her mind sharp for the important meetings in D.C. The flight attendants eventually began the usual snack and drink service, rolling carts down the aisle. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign flickered back on. A rumble coursed through the plane as it encountered mild turbulence. Most passengers either dozed off or continued watching movies, unbothered. Alicia felt a slight knot in her stomach, the result of a slight dip, but she knew these bumps were nothing to worry about. Then the turbulence smoothed out as quickly as it had started. Suddenly, a voice came over the intercom. It was Captain Tyler, but his tone was not the measured, calm voice of a standard flight announcement. Instead, it carried a dismissive edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered some mild turbulence, but should be past the worst of it. I'd appreciate it if passengers refrain from wandering the cabin unless it's absolutely necessary. Let's use our common sense, shall we?" Alicia caught the surprised look of the law student seated next to her. Others in the cabin exchanged puzzled glances. Captains usually didn't speak so sharply. Something about his phrasing suggested an underlying contempt. A hush fell over the cabin, broken only by the hum of the engines. About 15 minutes later, a flight attendant, a young man named Joshua, approached Alicia's row to see if anyone needed anything. He was polite, asking if the passenger with the crying toddler needed an extra pillow or blanket. He also offered Alicia a cup of water and a courtesy snack. Alicia smiled and graciously accepted. She noticed Joshua's slightly strained expression, as if something weighed on him. He walked away, continuing his rounds. 15 more minutes passed, and Captain Tyler's voice returned to the intercom with another biting announcement. "Passengers are reminded to remain seated. We're still in a choppy air layer, and we don't need any accidents on board. Flight attendants, discontinue service immediately." That's an order. A couple of flight attendants who were still distributing water paused, looking uneasy but complying. Alicia bristled. The air felt stable now, not severely turbulent. Also, the pilot's tone was downright hostile, like a teacher scolding misbehaving children. In her years of traveling, Alicia had rarely encountered a pilot so outwardly abrasive. As the flight pressed on, murmurs spread among the passengers. A couple of travelers pressed the call button, presumably to ask about connecting flights or for water. Joshua and the other flight attendants did their best to pacify everyone. But each time Captain Tyler's voice crackled over the speakers, it seemed to heighten the tension, as if he was using the mild turbulence as an excuse to assert absolute control. Alicia tried to remain calm and decided to observe how this played out, but a sense of foreboding settled in her mind. She had encountered difficult pilots before, but rarely one so flagrantly brash in front of a plane full of passengers. Little did she know that this was only the beginning of the friction she would experience with Captain Tyler. When the plane finally settled into a calm cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers gratefully stretched their legs, and a few hurried to the lavatories. Alicia decided to take a quick break as well. She needed to clear her mind and maybe splash some water on her face to refresh. Sliding past her seatmate, she walked toward the front of the cabin. As she neared the first-class galley, she noticed Captain Tyler standing just outside the cockpit door, engaged in a heated conversation with Joshua. The flight attendant looked pale, his eyes darting around as if searching for a quick escape. The pilot's voice was subdued but intense. "I don't care if you think it's safe to serve. When I say discontinue service, you do it immediately. That's the chain of command. Do you understand?" Joshua attempted to maintain his composure. "Yes, Captain, I do." "I just thought." "Don't think," Tyler snapped. "Just follow orders." Alicia slowed her pace. She tried not to intrude, but the conversation was hard to ignore. She could sense the tension radiating off Joshua. The flight attendant lowered his head slightly, muttered an apology, and scurried back toward the economy cabin. Captain Tyler glanced around, and his eyes landed on Alicia. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was an intensity in his gaze, one part annoyance, one part brazen curiosity, as though he was silently asking, "What are you looking at?" Alicia straightened her spine and offered a polite nod, then continued down the aisle toward the lavatory. She closed the lavatory door behind her, heart pounding in an unexpected surge of adrenaline. She had no reason to fear him, but something about his harsh manner unnerved her. Releasing a slow breath, Alicia reminded herself that she had faced tougher personalities in her career. She was the deputy administrator of the FAA, an organization that oversaw flight safety and regulations across the country. She knew the rules, the protocols, and the code of conduct expected of airline employees. But as a paying passenger, she had no immediate desire to pull rank. She had come to travel incognito after all, yet she couldn't help but wonder if she should say something on behalf of the passengers, the flight attendants, or just as a matter of principle. Then again, a direct confrontation with the captain mid-flight could be disastrous, especially if he felt challenged. Pilots held enormous authority in the air. It might be best for her to wait and gather more information. Splashed water on her face, Alicia shook off the tension. She exited the lavatory and made her way back toward her seat. However, she was stopped abruptly by a passenger in the aisle, the same middle-aged woman who had argued about overhead bin space earlier. "Excuse me," the woman said, her face etched with anxiety. "Do you have any idea if we'll be allowed to get water soon? My throat's been so dry, and the flight attendant said they had to halt service." Alicia forced a reassuring smile. "I'm not sure, ma'am. The turbulence was supposed to have cleared by now, but hopefully they'll resume soon. If not, you might want to press the call button. They can usually provide water even if the service cart is put away." The woman sighed, nodding. "All right. Thank you, dear." The seemingly mundane question shed light on a bigger issue. The pilot's attitude was inconveniencing everyone on board, potentially depriving them of basic comforts over what appeared to be a trivial power flex. As Alicia resumed her walk back, she noticed more people looking restless. A child asked for juice, a diabetic man pressed his call button for some reason, and several older passengers were uneasy. Service in mid-flight should have resumed, especially if conditions were safe. Returning to her seat, Alicia mentally catalogued everything she had witnessed. She had a growing suspicion that Captain Tyler's intimidation tactics might escalate further before landing. Though she hoped it wouldn't come to that, she prepared herself for the possibility that she might need to step in, especially if passenger safety or dignity was compromised in any way. After another half-hour of tense, borderline hostile announcements from Captain Tyler, the flight attendants were finally allowed to make a final pass through the cabin to collect trash. The cabin air was thick with anxiety. People whispered concerns to each other. Some merely looked down at their phones or books, trying to endure the flight with minimal friction. Alicia sensed that each member of the flight crew walked on eggshells, trying not to provoke the captain. She couldn't blame them. No one wanted a conflict at 35,000 feet. Nonetheless, a pilot's job required leadership, calm in crisis, and empathy for passengers and crew alike. Tyler's actions were the antithesis of that. It made Alicia question how many times he might have treated others similarly in the past without repercussions. Eventually, the pilot's voice announced their initial descent. The flight began to gently lower its altitude, preparing for arrival at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Passengers seemed relieved that the flight was nearing its end. They sat upright, stowed tray tables, and stored away personal items. But then, trouble struck. As the plane reduced speed, mild turbulence returned. This time, it was just enough to jostle the flight attendants in the galley. Everyone braced. The seatbelt sign blinked on once more, accompanied by Captain Tyler's all too familiar scolding tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing a rough approach. Flight attendants, secure the cabin immediately, no exceptions." The plane dipped slightly, causing a collective gasp. Alicia's own stomach fluttered at the sudden drop, but she remained calm. Pilots sometimes had to be firm in their announcements for safety reasons. However, the choice of words and attitude from Tyler made it sound like a personal reprimand, as though the passengers and crew were misbehaving children. Another jolt, then the plane steadied. Alicia gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. The flight attendant, Joshua, hurried through the cabin to check seatbelts, looking panicked as he tried to do his job swiftly under the pilot's watchful eye. The overhead bins rattled but stayed shut. "We'll be on the ground shortly," Tyler announced. "Please, don't do anything foolish." A collective sigh, some anxious laughter, and then hush. Alicia's mind raced. She had read countless reports of near misses and passenger incidents caused by pilot or crew mishandling. In her position at the FAA, she was acutely aware that tension in the cockpit could lead to compromised decision-making. She had never personally witnessed such a blatant disregard for professional courtesy. On top of that, the pilot's borderline harassment of the flight attendants and passengers had rattled everyone. At last, the wheels touched the runway with a bump and a screech. Applause broke out sporadically, partly out of relief. The plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign went off. As soon as the door opened, a handful of passengers bolted up, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Alicia remained seated a moment longer, watching Captain Tyler, who had now stepped out of the cockpit to oversee the disembarkation in person. It was unusual for a pilot to stand at the front like that typically. That was a moment for the flight attendants to guide passengers. But there he was, scrutinizing each traveler as they passed, a firm set to his jaw. When Alicia finally rose and joined the line, her heart thumped. She had a choice: slip away anonymously or speak up. With measured steps, she reached the front of the cabin and approached the cockpit door. Captain Tyler's eyes snapped to her, as if daring her to say something. She offered a polite, if cool, "Thank you for the flight." The pilot nodded, eyes narrowing. He responded with a curt, "Have a good day, ma'am," but the words lacked any genuine warmth. Alicia noted the rigid posture, the silent challenge in his stare. She gave him a tight smile and disembarked, not saying another word. But inside, she had already decided this incident would not go unexamined. Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport teemed with activity. Alicia stepped off the jet bridge and followed the signs toward baggage claim. Each purposeful stride was fueled by a swirl of conflicting emotions: anger, disappointment, and a sense of duty. During the flight, she had remained the quiet passenger in seat 23A, but now her role as deputy administrator of the FAA loomed large in her mind. She was no stranger to confronting aviation staff about misconduct. Over the years, she had penned and approved numerous directives to enhance passenger comfort, flight safety, and crew conduct protocols. Yet, She had rarely faced a situation where the pilot, arguably the most crucial figure of any flight, displayed such unprofessional behavior. A part of her felt an urge to walk away. After all, she had a jam-packed schedule of policy meetings and budget negotiations. Confronting Captain Tyler could spiral into a drawn-out investigation, paperwork, and potential blowback from the airline. Pilots were heavily unionized, and an investigation might get messy. Another side of her, however, knew that the entire aviation system suffered when people like Tyler operated unchecked. After retrieving her small carry-on from baggage claim, Alicia made a discreet phone call to her assistant, Isabella, who was waiting in the arrivals area. Isabella recognized Alicia immediately, her dark, curly hair pinned back in a neat bun, face glowing with relief that her boss had arrived safely. "Miss Grant, so good to see you. How was your flight?" Isabella asked, taking Alicia's carry-on to help. Alicia hesitated, scanning the area. She lowered her voice. "We need to talk, but not here." The young assistant nodded, her concern evident. Together, they walked out of the terminal to where a black sedan was waiting. Once inside, Alicia exhaled and gave Isabella a rundown of the events on the flight. Captain Tyler's demeaning announcements, his treatment of both passengers and crew, and her own internal conflict about how to handle the situation. Isabella jotted down notes on a tablet. "That's awful. Do you plan to file an incident report, or do you want me to escalate this internally first?" "I'm not sure yet," Alicia admitted. "I want to gather more information. I might request the flight records, talk to the flight attendants if I can, and see if there have been prior complaints about Tyler. But this can't be ignored." He created an unsafe atmosphere, psychologically if not physically. If anything had gone seriously wrong, that tension could have compromised real emergency procedures. Isabella nodded with empathy. "We can discreetly start an inquiry, and if we find substantial evidence of misconduct, we can escalate further. Let's keep your identity under wraps for now, though, so it doesn't look like a personal vendetta." Alicia agreed, relieved that her assistant was on the same page. Still, she felt a pang of sadness. She had no desire to see someone's career ruined, but the well-being of thousands of passengers had to come first. If Captain Tyler's behavior was part of a pattern, it had to be dealt with swiftly and firmly. As the sedan navigated through Washington, D.C.'s busy streets toward the FAA headquarters, Alicia's gaze lingered on the passing landmarks, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome in the distance. She had always been proud of her work, of striving to ensure fairness and safety in the skies. Now, she sensed she was on the cusp of a personal test. Would she fully exercise her authority to stand up for what was right, or would she stay silent like so many before her? She was about to find out. Alicia's first stop that afternoon was a high-level meeting at FAA headquarters regarding upcoming changes to flight safety protocols. She entered the large conference room walls, lined with aviation charts, a long oak table at its center where about a dozen other officials and experts awaited. She forced her mind to focus on the agenda at hand, discussing new training requirements for airline crew and updated regulations for small regional carriers. Despite her attempts to remain professional, Alicia couldn't fully shake off the morning's flight incident. Each time a colleague mentioned pilot discipline or crew training, her thoughts drifted back to Captain Tyler's sneering face. At one point, she nearly fumbled her presentation slides when her mind veered to the memory of his harsh announcements. After the meeting concluded, Alicia asked her personal assistant to join her in a smaller conference room. Inside, they spread out various documents, including a list of potential internal investigation steps. First on the list was to contact Delta's management team. Second, to discreetly request the flight's cockpit voice recordings and cabin service logs. Third, to identify any prior complaints lodged against Captain Tyler. "We'll do this by the book," Alicia said firmly. "I won't rely on a single flight incident. If he has a history of unprofessional behavior, it'll be documented. If this is a one-off, we'll proceed accordingly." Isabella nodded, already typing out requests for the relevant data. "Understood. I'll request the official flight logs and any passenger feedback forms that might have been filed." "Yes, do that," Alicia answered. "Meanwhile, I'll draft a letter to Delta's Director of Flight Operations. We need to handle this politely but firmly, making it clear that we're looking into a possible violation of FAA conduct guidelines." That afternoon, Alicia penned a carefully worded communication, devoid of emotion but loaded with official gravity. She refrained from mentioning that she had been on the flight. She merely stated that the FAA received reports of potential misconduct by Captain Lawrence Tyler on Flight 763 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. on the specified date. She requested cooperation in verifying details of his behavior, including recorded announcements if available. Before sending the letter, she paused. She had hoped to keep her identity out of it for now, but the letter had to be signed by someone with sufficient authority to request such records. Reluctantly, she affixed her name, Alicia Grant, Deputy Administrator. "Let's see how they respond," she said to Isabella, pressing send. That evening, while most employees trickled out of the building, Alicia remained in her office. She reread FAA guidelines on crew behavior and passenger rights. Officially, the pilot is the final authority on an aircraft in flight. However, that authority does not grant them the right to verbally abuse or harass those in their charge. The guidelines were unequivocal. A pilot's primary responsibility is passenger safety and comfort. Any behavior undermining that responsibility could be grounds for disciplinary action, up to license suspension or revocation. As midnight neared, Alicia finally left for home. She felt drained, torn between her roles as a high-ranking official enforcing regulations and as a black woman who had experienced humiliation by this same pilot. While she wanted justice for herself and others, she also wanted to ensure the process remained fair and impartial. She could practically hear her mother's wise words echo in her mind. "When you hold power, use it responsibly, but don't be afraid to use it." Little did she know how quickly the situation would escalate once Delta's management got wind of the complaint. Back in Atlanta, Captain Lawrence Tyler had no clue a formal complaint was in the works. He carried on with his usual routine, rotating between flights to different U.S. cities. On a flight to Dallas, the day after the Washington route, he scolded a flight attendant for being too lenient with a crying child. The next day, on a flight to Chicago, he berated a gate agent for not having his coffee ready. His short temper and arrogance were well known among staff, but they had learned to navigate him with caution. That changed abruptly one evening when Tyler received a summons from Delta's Director of Flight Operations, Hannah Wilcox. A terse email asked him to appear in her office at the Atlanta headquarters the following morning to discuss a matter of urgent importance. Tyler frowned at the message. He had always considered Hannah a soft-spoken, by-the-book manager. He suspected this might be about a minor passenger complaint, something he could usually shrug off. He had a thick folder of them over the years, but none had seriously jeopardized his job. He had one of the best flight performance records in the airline. The company needed him, or so he believed. The next morning, Tyler walked into Hannah Wilcox's office with the same casual arrogance that accompanied him everywhere. Her office, though simple in decor, radiated authority. Diplomas and flight certificates lined the walls alongside a large plaque featuring the Delta logo. Hannah gestured for him to sit. She wasted no time. "Captain Tyler, we have a major problem. The FAA has opened an inquiry into a recent flight. You piloted Flight 763 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. The complaint alleges serious misconduct. His smug expression faltered momentarily, then returned. A passenger complaint? That's nothing new, he said, trying to wave it off. I can provide the standard response. It's not standard, Captain, Hannah said, sliding a printed copy of the FAA letter across the desk. The deputy administrator herself signed this. They're requesting cockpit audio, passenger feedback, and all relevant records. We're obligated to comply fully. Tyler's eyes skimmed the letter. Deputy Administrator, Alicia Grant, he muttered. The name didn't ring a bell. Why would the second-in-command of the FAA personally sign off on something like this? We don't know, Hannah replied, leaning forward. But it means they're taking this very seriously. The allegations mention that you publicly humiliated passengers and crew and used your authority to create a hostile environment. If true, it violates federal regulations and Delta's own code of conduct, Tyler scoffed. This is absurd. Passengers exaggerate all the time. My first priority is safety. If I have to be firm, I'm firm. That's my job. You know that. Hannah nodded, but her face remained stern. The days of captains reigning as tyrants in the sky are over, Tyler. Passengers pay attention. Flight attendants have rights, and the FAA is within its jurisdiction to demand an investigation. If they find cause, they can suspend or revoke your license or force us to terminate you. His spine stiffened. Terminate me? Ridiculous. My record speaks for itself. Hannah sighed, massaging her temple. Look, I'm not your enemy. I've always recognized your technical skill. But if you want to keep your career, you need to cooperate fully. We're going to gather all the evidence. If you have a defense, provide it. We'll see what the FAA decides. Tyler stood, anger flaring in his chest. Fine, I have nothing to hide. The FAA can dig all they want. I doubt they'll find anything substantial. He left Hannah's office, fists clenched, cursing under his breath. For the first time, a flicker of fear gnawed at him. This was not just another routine complaint. The FAA's second highest official was personally involved. How had it come to that? As he stepped outside into the parking lot, the Georgia sun beating down on his uniform, a cold sweat gathered at his temples. Something in the pit of his stomach told him this time he might be in real trouble. Back in D.C., Alicia had received Delta's acknowledgement of her request. She saw that the airline was now fully cooperating, which meant Tyler would soon know he was under investigation. Alicia felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She wanted fairness, but a part of her also felt a twinge of personal satisfaction, remembering how his condescending voice had grated on her, how he had glared at her, how he had frightened other passengers. The next steps involved collecting statements from both passengers and flight attendants. To maintain impartiality, Alicia assigned 2 subordinates from the FAA's compliance division to handle the interviews. She provided them with the passenger manifest, including her own name, but instructed them to treat Alicia Grant like any other passenger for the sake of objectivity. Only if absolutely necessary would they reveal that she was the deputy administrator. Over the course of a week, the compliance division interviewed flight attendants who worked Flight 763. Joshua, the young flight attendant, recounted how Captain Tyler had berated him for attempting to serve water during a minor turbulence patch, describing Tyler as aggressively condescending, borderline threatening. Several passengers, including the mother of the crying toddler, shared that they felt intimidated or belittled. One first-class passenger admitted that Tyler hadn't been outwardly rude to her, but she noticed his unnecessarily stern approach toward a fellow passenger over bin space. Another passenger, the law student who sat next to Alicia, corroborated the multiple scolding announcements Tyler had made. In total, the division compiled a weighty file of testimonies, each painting a consistent picture of an authoritarian, dismissive pilot. The cockpit voice recordings, while not capturing every nuance, revealed Tyler's side of the conversation with the co-pilot and flight attendants. Phrases like "shut that down now" and "they can wait" peppered his remarks. While no direct racial slurs or overtly discriminatory language appeared on the tapes, the tone was undeniably aggressive. Alicia watched the mounting evidence with a growing sense of resolve. It was no longer about her personal experience alone. This pilot posed a genuine concern to passenger safety and crew welfare. She forwarded the data to the FAA's legal department, which began drafting a potential notice of violation. This would be the formal document listing the infractions of federal regulation that Tyler may have committed. At the same time, she received an unexpected memo from the higher-ups in the FAA. Certain airline unions and lobbying groups had gotten wind of the inquiry. They were curious why so much attention was being given to a single pilot's behavior. The memo gently warned Alicia to proceed carefully, as political forces might see this as an attempt to penalize pilots for exercising necessary authority in flight. Alicia sighed, rolling her shoulders to relieve tension. Bureaucracy and politics were inevitable in her position. Yet, she refused to let them derail a legitimate investigation. Carefully, she drafted a response, clarifying that the inquiry was about potential misuse of authority and not about restricting a pilot's ability to ensure safety. After finishing her final email for the day, Alicia shut off her computer. She looked out her office window at the city lights reflecting on the Potomac River. Her mind drifted back to how it felt to be humiliated, to see fear in the eyes of fellow passengers. This is bigger than me, she thought. We have to protect people from a pilot who thinks he's above the rules. Unbeknownst to her, Captain Tyler was about to escalate the situation in a way no one saw coming. Across the country in Atlanta, Captain Tyler seethed in his condominium overlooking the city skyline. In the weeks since he first learned of the FAA inquiry, the airline had reduced his flight assignments and placed him on partial leave. Officially, they claimed it was for scheduling reasons, but he knew the real cause. They wanted him grounded until the investigation concluded. The humiliating reality sank in each morning he woke up without an assignment. "I've given them 25 years of my life," he muttered, pacing his living room. "Is this how they repay me?" He had tried calling in favors from a few sympathetic higher-ups and union representatives, but the seriousness of an FAA deputy administrator's direct involvement stymied them. His union representative advised him to stay calm and fully comply, which only fueled Tyler's anger. The idea of being calm while his professional life was under siege felt impossible. One afternoon, restlessly scrolling through social media, Tyler stumbled across a name in an aviation forum, Alicia Grant. The post was about FAA's rising star. The discussion lauded her for championing passenger rights and crew safety improvements. That's when it dawned on him. Alicia Grant was the same name on the FAA letter. Could she have been on that flight? He felt a chill, remembering the poised black woman who had nodded at him with that unreadable expression. No wonder she had that air of confidence, he thought bitterly. She was sizing me up the whole time. Consumed by rage, Tyler called an old friend, a journalist at a small but inflammatory web publication. Over the years, Tyler had fed this journalist tidbits of insider news in exchange for favorable coverage. Now, he saw an opportunity to try to smear Alicia's reputation, or at least paint her as an overreaching bureaucrat. During their phone call, Tyler spun a dramatic tale. He claimed that Alicia Grant, the FAA deputy administrator, had used her authority to personally target him for no valid reason. He framed himself as a victim of political ambition. He described Alicia as an unknown passenger who sabotaged him and painted the entire inquiry as a witch hunt spurred by a passenger's petty complaints. The journalist, sensing a scandalous scoop, agreed to write an article. A few days later, an inflammatory headline appeared online: FAA official abuses power to punish veteran pilot. Is this justice or vendetta? The story quoted an anonymous pilot alleging the FAA official had a personal grudge. It questioned the fairness of the investigation, hinting at reverse discrimination, pointing out that the official was a black woman, and suggesting that the pilot was being targeted for his stance on strict cabin rules. The piece circulated among certain corners of the internet, stirring controversy. Some people quickly saw through it, recognizing it as a biased hit piece with no concrete evidence. Others, particularly those who disliked the growing emphasis on passenger rights, rallied behind Captain Tyler's cause. Social media buzzed with arguments. Was Alicia Grant overstepping her role, or was Tyler a tyrant? Alicia discovered the article when a colleague forwarded it to her. Reading it left her breathless with anger and dismay. She knew from experience that personal attacks came with being a high-profile official, but it still stung to see her motives misrepresented so flagrantly. She calmly issued a statement through the FAA press office, reaffirming the agency's commitment to impartial investigations. She did not mention Tyler by name, nor confirm she had been on that flight. Yet, the damage was done. Rumors spread, overshadowing the real issue, the pilot's documented misconduct. Tyler's gamble to go public was a double-edged sword. It made him look like a whistleblower to some, but to many others, it highlighted how far he might go to evade responsibility. In the days that followed, Alicia found her inbox flooded with messages. Some were supportive, urging her not to back down. Others were scathing, accusing her of exploiting her power for personal revenge. Aviation forums lit up with debates, and Alicia's name became a trending topic in niche aviation circles. The FAA's higher-ups requested a closed-door meeting to discuss the media blowback. Sitting at a long conference table, Alicia faced a panel of senior officials, including the administrator himself, a man named Gregory Lawson. He studied her carefully before speaking. "Alicia, I'm sure you've seen the article," Lawson began with a measured tone. "We have no intention of halting this inquiry, but we must ensure everything is done by the book, with no appearance of personal bias." Alicia straightened her shoulders. "Understood, sir. I've refrained from personally leading the investigation. Our compliance division is handling the interviews and evidence collection. My only involvement was filing the initial request for records." One official, a stern-faced woman named Susan Park, interjected, "Is there any personal stake here we need to worry about? The article suggests you were actually on that flight. Is that true?" Alicia hesitated. She knew honesty was crucial. "Yes, I was on board, but I did not identify myself to the pilot or the crew as an FAA official. I did, however, witness unprofessional behavior. That's why I requested the investigation. The evidence from other passengers and the cockpit recordings appear to confirm a pattern of misconduct." The room fell silent. Finally, Lawson nodded. "That's what I wanted to hear. It sounds like this was initiated properly. We'll back you, as long as the facts support the conclusion." Feeling a surge of relief, Alicia thanked them. She knew that the press might still twist the narrative, but as far as her colleagues were concerned, she had done the right thing. The inquiry would proceed with official authority. Later that evening, Alicia decided to address her own staff. Standing before a small crowd of her division members, she spoke with passion. "I won't pretend these accusations don't hurt," she said. "But let's remember our duty, to uphold aviation standards for everyone's safety and dignity. I ask each of you to stand strong. We operate with integrity. We let the evidence speak. If Captain Tyler is innocent of these charges, the investigation will show it. If not, we must act accordingly, no matter how loud the backlash. Applause filled the room. Encouraged, Alicia left the office with renewed vigor. She realized this wasn't just about one pilot or one flight anymore. It was a crucible testing her leadership and the FAA's resolve. In the end, the truth would prevail, and the agency had a responsibility to see it through. As the investigation headed toward its conclusion, Captain Tyler's frustration escalated. He posted on social media under pseudonyms, trying to rally more support, but the initial flurry of sympathetic responses waned as multiple first-hand accounts of his behavior surfaced. Former flight attendants shared anonymous stories of his bullying tactics, fueling the growing consensus that Tyler had indeed overstepped professional bounds. Meanwhile, the FAA's legal team meticulously reviewed the evidence. The cockpit recordings, passenger statements, and Tyler's track record formed a cohesive narrative of repeated misconduct. The final step was a formal hearing where Tyler would have the opportunity to present his defense. Alicia planned to attend, though she would not testify unless called upon. On the day of the hearing, an air of tense anticipation filled the FAA hearing room, a space with grey walls, an American flag in the corner, and a table where a review board of 3 officials presided. Tyler arrived in full pilot uniform, flanked by a union representative. Alicia arrived separately, sitting on the side, her expression neutral. The review board began by stating the allegations, unprofessional conduct, creating a hostile environment for crew and passengers, and potential jeopardy of safety due to misuse of authority. Tyler's lawyer argued that any negative impressions were subjective, attributing them to the stress of turbulence and necessary brevity in flight instructions. The highlight of the proceeding came when Joshua, the flight attendant from Flight 763, took the stand to give his statement. His voice shook at first, but he grew more confident as he recounted how Captain Tyler had repeatedly spoken to him in a demeaning tone, often in front of passengers. He also described how he feared retribution if he didn't comply with the captain's orders to suspend basic service, even when conditions were safe to continue. Tyler's lawyer tried to undermine Joshua's credibility, implying the young flight attendant was inexperienced. However, the review board had the cockpit tapes, confirming much of Joshua's account. After hours of testimony, the board called a brief recess. The tension in the room was palpable. Alicia stepped into the hallway, needing air. She didn't want to confront Tyler directly, but fate had other plans. As she turned a corner, she saw him standing near a water cooler, alone. Their eyes locked. "So it was you," Tyler spat quietly, looking her up and down with disdain. "You're the one who started this whole farce." Alicia inhaled slowly. "I only reported what happened," she replied, her voice level. "The rest of the evidence speaks for itself." "You realize you could ruin my life," he hissed, stepping closer. "I've been a pilot for over 2 decades. This is all I have." She stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't take pleasure in seeing anyone's career jeopardized, but we have a responsibility to passenger safety and professional standards. You crossed lines, Captain Tyler, multiple lines." He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. "I hope you can live with yourself when I'm out of a job." Alicia's jaw tightened, but she met his glare head-on. "I'm more concerned about the passengers and crew who have to endure your behavior. If the board decides you deserve another chance, so be it. But don't blame me for consequences of your own actions." With that, she turned and walked away, heart hammering in her chest. She was shaken by his quiet rage, but also emboldened. "He can threaten me all he wants," she thought. "I won't let him compromise the skies we all depend on." The hearing resumed. The FAA review board summed up the findings. An overwhelming body of evidence showed that Tyler had indeed engaged in repeated misconduct, violating both Delta's code of conduct and federal guidelines regarding crew and passenger treatment. While he hadn't committed a direct safety violation like flying under the influence or ignoring critical warnings, his behavior was deemed a serious and escalating concern. The board called for a final statement from Tyler. He spoke angrily about how he was being singled out, how new policies coddled passengers, and how his firm style of leadership was being misunderstood. He glared at Alicia once, but she refused to break eye contact. After deliberating in private, the board delivered its decision. Captain Lawrence Tyler's license would be suspended for 6 months, pending completion of an intensive retraining and anger management program. If he did not comply or showed further misconduct, the FAA reserved the right to revoke his license entirely. Tyler's face turned red, and he looked like he was on the verge of shouting. His union rep placed a hand on his shoulder. Some part of him must have realized that immediate outburst would only make things worse. He bit back whatever he wanted to say, stood stiffly, and stormed out of the room. As the hearing concluded, Alicia felt a wave of relief. The system had worked. There was no triumph in seeing a seasoned pilot disciplined, but the skies would be safer. Crew members wouldn't have to walk on eggshells around Tyler anymore, and passengers would be spared his contempt. In the hallway outside, the flight attendants who had testified huddled together, a mixture of relief and sadness on their faces. The law student passenger, who had also provided a written statement, approached Alicia and thanked her for standing up for what was right. Joshua, eyes brimmed with gratitude, managed a half-smile. "Thank you, Miss Grant, for taking this seriously," he said softly. Alicia simply nodded, touched by their trust. She recognized the impact this decision might have for the future of pilot accountability. And as she stepped out of the FAA building, the sun setting over DC's skyline, she felt at peace with the role she'd played in ensuring that justice and fairness prevailed. In the end, justice isn't about bringing someone down, it's about ensuring everyone rises to the standard of respect and responsibility we all deserve. One flight, one pilot, and one determined passenger happened to cross paths, but their story left an imprint far wider than any flight path on a map. Today, Captain Tyler faces the consequences of his own arrogance, his license suspended and his reputation tarnished, while Alicia Grant stands as a testament to professional integrity and courage. She didn't seek vengeance, she sought accountability and brought it to light for the betterment of all. May this story serve as a reminder that no matter who you are or what uniform you wear, your actions carry weight. If you enjoyed hearing about this intense journey of karma and accountability, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more stories to life stories that matter.